Alright, guys, let me tell you about something that happened on a farm not too far from here. It's the kind of story that makes you believe in the power of patience, creativity, and yes, getting some good, old-fashioned revenge in a totally legal and clever way. So, grab your snacks, sit back, and get ready for the tale of Hank Jordan, a farmer who had to deal with a very entitled neighbor named Karen Tillman. Hank and his wife Pam lived a pretty peaceful life. They had a beautiful piece of farmland that was everything they'd worked for. The land was rich, the corn grew so sweet you could eat it right off the stalk, and life was simple. But like so many rural communities, things started to change. A fancy new neighborhood popped up next door. They called it Whispering Pines, which honestly sounds like a place where you'd hear the rustling of leaves and maybe some peaceful conversations. But the reality, the only thing whispering in that neighborhood were the neighbors talking about each other. Now, at first, Hank and Pam didn't pay much attention to their new neighbors. They kept to themselves, didn't interfere, and expected the same in return. But that all changed when Karen Tillman was elected president of the Homeowners Association. You know the type. She drove a pink Range Rover. And I don't mean just any pink. I mean bubblegum pink, the kind of car you wouldn't miss even if you were blindfolded. But that wasn't the issue. What Karen did next was what set everything into motion. One day, Hank was on his porch, sipping his coffee, when he saw Karen's pink Range Rover coming down the road. But instead of turning onto the actual street like everyone else, she just drove straight through Hank's field. She bounced over rows of young corn like it was an off-road playground, and for a moment, Hank thought maybe it was an accident. But then it became clear, it was no accident. It was a choice. Karen kept doing it, twice a week. At 4 p.m. like clockwork, she'd drive right through Hank's field, leaving a trail of broken stalks and damaged crops. The first time, Hank figured maybe she didn't know better. Maybe she was new to the area. But after a few weeks, when it became a regular habit, he realized that this wasn't an accident at all. And to make it worse, when Hank put up signs, big, clear signs saying private property, no trespassing, crop damage is a felony, Karen didn't even flinch. She didn't stop. She didn't apologize. Instead, she laughed. Yeah, she actually laughed. She drove up to one of the signs, slowed down for just a second, and then rolled down her window. Hank could hear her laugh from his porch across the field. She revved the engine and drove right around the sign, making the damage even worse. At this point, Hank was pissed, but not out of ideas. He wasn't the type to just sit back and let someone walk all over him. He'd spent his whole life working the land, and he wasn't about to let some entitled woman in a pink Range Rover destroy his livelihood. He needed a plan, and it needed to be smart, something Karen couldn't ignore, something that would make her really think twice. So, Hank and Pam came up with a plan. They knew the law was on their side, but they also knew that Karen wasn't going to care about signs. They needed something a little more inconvenient. Hank went to the local hardware store and bought 10 tons of gravel, heavy, sharp-edged gravel. He spent days hauling it in with his tractor, using it to create a clear, legal access path along the property line. It was perfect, a gravel lane that wouldn't just be a better route for Hank's farm equipment, but also a clear path that Karen could use without driving through the corn. Hank even put up another sign at the entrance, saying, "Farm Vehicle Crossing." He was trying to make it easy for her, give her an alternative. After all, the last thing Hank wanted was conflict. But Karen didn't care. She didn't take the hint. A few days later, Karen drove right past the gravel lane and plowed straight through the corn again. This time, Hank had had enough. But instead of taking direct action, he got a little creative. He noticed that the weather forecast was calling for a big storm, a huge rainstorm. Perfect. Hank had a plan, and this was his moment to put it into action. With the storm rolling in, Hank got to work. He didn't want to block Karen's path with a gate or anything that could be considered an obstruction. No, he had a different idea. He knew that creating a small, subtle drainage channel could make that shortcut she loved so much into a literal swamp. So, Hank used his tractor again, carefully sculpting the land so that when the rain hit, it would pool right in the spot where Karen usually cut through. He didn't create a ditch or a hole. He just reshaped the soil so that it naturally channeled the water. By the time the storm hit, the field was ready. The rain fell hard, and it didn't take long for Hank's carefully crafted mud trap to turn into a lake of thick, sticky mud. Karen wouldn't be able to drive through it now, even if she wanted to. And he knew she would want to. Sure enough, the next day, Karen showed up right on schedule. She slowed down as she approached the gravel lane. But of course, she didn't take it. Why would she use the sensible, easy path when there was a big open field, right? So, she turned off the road and aimed for the muddy stretch. For a brief moment, she actually made it a few feet into the mud before she realized her mistake. And then, her Range Rover got stuck. Completely stuck. The wheels spun uselessly, sending mud flying everywhere. She tried to reverse. Nothing. She tried going forward again. Still nothing. At this point, Karen was trapped. And Hank was watching the whole thing unfold from his kitchen window. Now, if you're like me, you probably can't help but feel a little satisfaction watching someone who's been a nuisance get exactly what's coming to them. But Hank wasn't done yet. He wasn't just going to let her sit there in the mud. He had proof, and he knew the only way to make her realize the consequences of her actions was to let the system handle it. Hank and Pam had a trail camera set up in the field, and they had caught everything on tape. The signs, the gravel path, Karen laughing and ignoring them all, it was all there. So, Hank called the sheriff's department, and things started to escalate. Karen called a tow truck to help, but the driver, who looked like a guy who spent more time fixing his truck than actually towing, ignored Hank's requests to stay on the gravel lane and instead drove right into the field, tearing it up even more. The truck got stuck, too. At this point, it was clear that Karen wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this one. The sheriff arrived, and the evidence was clear of trespassing, destruction of property, and assault thanks to the tow truck driver's antics. Karen was issued a citation for trespassing, and Bubba, the tow truck driver, was arrested for assault. After everything went down, Hank and Pam spent the next few weeks documenting the damage, photos, videos, quotes for repairs, and even soil tests to prove contamination from the tow truck. They put together a huge binder with everything, including the sheriff's report and Karen's own insurance company's denial of her claim. It was all there, and when the whole meeting rolled around, Pam and Hank were ready. They showed up with their binder and their evidence, and while Karen tried to spin her story, the facts spoke for themselves. The neighbors were done with her. The HOA voted her out, and the damage she caused became public knowledge. But that wasn't the end of it. Hank filed a lawsuit for the damages, and when it went to court, the judge couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence. Karen lost, big time. She ended up paying Hank the full amount of damages, which he used to fix the field, replace the irrigation system, and even put up a proper gate, one that Karen couldn't drive through no matter what. As for Karen, well, she was out of the HOA. Her reputation was shot, and the once proud owner of a pink Range Rover was now living with the consequences of her actions. Hank and Pam, on the other hand, restored their farm and enjoyed the peace that came with standing up for what's right. So, what's the takeaway from this whole story? Don't mess with people who know their rights, who play by the rules, and who are willing to stand their ground. Sometimes, being patient, clever, and using the law to your advantage can be the best way to deal with a Karen. All right, folks, that's the story. If you've ever had to deal with an entitled neighbor or just had an epic take that moment, I want to hear it in the comments. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Until next time, keep your boundaries clear and your karma in check.